1. Crash and chaos. The Trine 7's heat shield groaned in protest as the upper atmosphere punched at its hull, every bolt and seam rattling in the storm's teeth. Lyra Saren gripped the yoke and levered her elbows inward, minimizing her silhouette, tuning her body to the geometry of the pilot's chair, trying to make herself the narrowest possible target for chaos. Behind her, the cargo bay shuddered with acceleration. A chorus of containment straps sang arrhythmically, and thin, metal on metal. The shuttle, built for precision handling, flew now like a brick lacking flamboyance. Lyra's wrists hummed from the violence of microcorrections, her jaw set so tight she felt each tooth grinding in its root. She didn't curse, didn't shout. Attitude Delta 5.3. The shuttle's AI navigation system beeped, brittle and off-tempo. Lyra rolled the ship hard to port, hands feathering the trim, feeling the control stick's subtle give beneath the surface panic covering her body. Across the forward viewport, holographic warning glyphs stacked in an orderly column, black on gold. Temperature, redlining. External radiation count, peaking. The hull sizzled with static discharge as plasma built in the nose cone, then bled off in shuddering bursts. Lyra exhaled slowly through her nose, oxygenating on the old Eridonian 4-count. It steadied her hands even as sweat slicked her palms inside the flight gloves. Trine 7 actual. Entering blackout zone. Estimate 3 minutes to comms. Reacquire. Her voice, through the suit's filter, sounded like it belonged to someone else. Steady, neutral, softer than she intended. Copy. 7, came the response, voice unmodulated and so deep it rattled the audio pickup. Kaen Vainik. She could picture him in the auxiliary seat, probably bracing with a single hand while monitoring system stress on the backup screen. He never sounded afraid, even as this new world tried to kill them. Recommend vector correction. Stormfront doubled back. Seen, executing. A tremor passed through the hull, the kind that originated from outside the shuttle. It was something magnetic, something alive. Lyra's gaze flicked to the EM meter, which jittered just long enough to make her tongue go dry. The navigation overlay painted the drop zone as a thinning blue target, but crosswinds sheared them to the east, vector bleeding off into the band of chromatic interference that ringed the planet's equator. The planetary storm was relentless, swarming bands of radiation and particulate ice, alternating with blacked-out zones of unknown weather, the kind of place you only entered if the data mattered more than your hull. Lyra hunched into her harness, calling up the override panel with a thumb press. The system stuttered, then yielded. Manual control engaged. All flight corrections locked to pilot. Her heart, stubborn thing, kept pace with the warning tones. Each alarm, a nudge, a challenge. She lived for these moments, not because she loved risk, but because the universe sharpened when it tried to kill you. Through the viewport, the sky had changed into a rippling afterimage. Orange sheets of lightning folded into the clouds, then stitched apart with cracks of violet. Lyra's thoughts narrowed to a single line. Thread the storm, save the data. Everything else, even her own bones, could be a casualty. She steadied the nose with a short pulse of retro thrusters, counting off the deceleration in her head. When the next wall of wind hit, the shuttle slew left, almost beyond correction. A siren blared in the cockpit, a new alarm, one she'd never heard outside a simulator. Then Kaen's voice, measured through the calm. Brace. Nose up, 35 degrees. Lyra's hands obeyed before she could argue with instinct. She pulled back, throttle cut, letting momentum do the hard work. For an instant, the shuttle seemed to hang in the throat of the storm, every motion balanced between grace and annihilation. Then gravity reasserted itself, and the world dropped out from under her. She bit her tongue, tasted copper. The shuttle rolled, and with it, Lyra. Her harness kept her centered, but the acceleration pressed her spine flat against the seat. Warning glyphs strobed, then failed as the main battery overloaded. Only the secondary battery for the viewport display remained, flickering through a static haze. Impact was inevitable now. The ground was coming up, a smear of green-black jungle and glassy ravines. Lyra tried one last time to stabilize. The stick bucked in her grip, but she managed to regain some control. "Kaen?" she called, more on reflex than hope. Static. She scanned the crash vector as the ship continued to spin, picked the least catastrophic angle, and locked the controls. "Hold," she whispered, to the shuttle, to herself, to anyone still listening. The forest took them at terminal velocity. The hull hit the canopy first, then the trunks, and finally the brittle resistance of alien wood splintered under the engineered alloy. The nose cone compacted, and the floor beneath them buckled. The world became a compressive force as screeching metal sounded, and the sting of ozone ruptured through vents. Lyra's last conscious thought was a math problem. How many G's? How much blood? How many bones? Then the shuttle slammed to a halt in the green heart of the storm, and her vision pinwheeled to black. At first, there was only pulse, deep and private, echoing in the wells of her ears. Then the rest of her surroundings seeped in. There was a crackle of burning insulation, the metallic ping of cooling alloy, the low, wet rush of her own breath behind her teeth. Lyra's eyelids parted to a haze of orange and gray, light filtering through fractures. It took her a full minute to interpret the new geometry of the shuttle. The Trine 7 was no longer a vessel, but a wedge jammed half-deep into the roots and sedimentary rock lining the alien ravine. The forward bulkhead had accordioned, compressing the cockpit to the size of a survival pod. Overhead wiring bled luminous motes into the haze. Below, the pilot's console was tilted, a crack splintering from its center. She flexed her right hand and watched as the fingers trembled. The suit's diagnostic readout blinked a summary across her visor. Contusions along the left arm, blood oxygen dropping, cranial impact yellow, not red. She had time. Her first thought was of the mission data collected upon approach, the environmental drive. She clawed at the panel above her left knee, feeling each click as an electrical jolt in her forearm. It took 3 tries, but the case finally yielded. The drive fell out, cradled in black polyfoam. She palmed it, tucked it inside her flight vest, with the reverence of a priest handling a relic. Only then did her brain allow the second thought, Kaen. She triggered her comm with a dry click. Auxiliary, respond. Her voice crackled, swallowed by static. No answer. She pulled at her harness, jammed. The emergency buckle was fused shut by heat, so she braced her heel against the seat and twisted her torso until the mesh webbing snapped. A fresh spike of pain shot through her shoulder, followed by the wet heat of blood. She ignored it. Lyra had always been good at compartmentalizing. Pain was another file to be sorted. The cockpit hatch had crumpled in the crash, leaving only a narrow slice of daylight on the port side. Lyra wedged her hands into the gap, fingers slipping on congealed foam, and shoved until the metal groaned. On the third try, the panel gave way, springing open with a hiss of vapor. The sudden, acrid air hit her face through hairline fissures along the side of her visor, setting every nerve in her sinuses on fire. Outside, the atmosphere shimmered with a faint, greasy fog. Something organic and sharp crawled up her nose, a flavor of sap and ionized dust. She braced herself against the edge of the hatch, feet dangling above the ruined floor. Below, a river of alien plant matter, green and thick as intestines, oozed slowly over the shuttle's underbelly, dotted with pulsing nodules that twitched at her movement. Higher up, the sky roiled with the aftershock of the storm. Clouds boiled in unnatural patterns, illuminated from below by the residual orange glow of plasma fire. She dropped to the ground, boots sinking into a wet sponge of moss. For a few seconds she crouched, head between her knees, willing the dizziness to pass. There was a low-frequency hum in the soil, barely perceptible but insistent, like a signal filtered through water. It vibrated through her bones, a planetary heartbeat that refused to harmonize with her own. Kaen. She tried again, this time into the raw air. Her voice bounced back at her, muted by the moss in the cloud. Nothing moved but the slow ripple of the plant river. It was easier to move than to think, so Lyra pushed herself upright and staggered forward, following the shuttle's scorched furrow through the alien undergrowth. Each step sent fresh pain up her right side, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. Visibility was poor in the valley. Steam rose from cracked mud, blurring the boundaries between living things and their shadows. The trees here weren't trees, they were vertical fungi, stalks sheathed in glassy bark, arching over the scar the shuttle had left, glowing faintly in the storm's half-light. Something in the air clung to her visor, a sticky haze that refracted the light into prisms. Every so often, she'd catch a flicker at the edge of vision, movement, but with no source to pin down. The first piece of wreckage appeared as a lump in the moss, barely recognizable as part of the Trine 7's dorsal panel, burnt at the edges. Something had torn it loose and off to the side, as if the very atmosphere wanted to erase their presence. She skirted it and kept on, avoiding the twitching sacs and veins that networked the ground. Her sense of time dissolved, measured only in the spiral count of her boots through the thick undergrowth. Then, sound, a rhythmic pulse, louder than the planetary hum, mechanical. Lyra froze, listening. It repeated 3, then 4 times, a regular but not comforting pattern. Not Kane's voice, but maybe Kane's handiwork. She adjusted her stride and bore toward the noise. 10 paces on, she found a crevice, black and veined with electric blue fungus. The edge was sharp enough to draw blood if you slipped, and the moss retracted from her boots as she approached. The mechanical sound was coming from below, mixed now with a wet coughing and a string of consonants that sounded almost like swearing. "I'm here!" Lyra shouted, voice scraping at her damaged throat. "Kaen!" Silence, then the faintest mechanical whirring. She inched closer to the edge, scouting for a stable descent. The drop was maybe 10 feet, lined with the same pulsing moss, the space below lit an oily green. Kaen was wedged between 2 slabs of alloy helmet off, bleeding from the scalp. He looked up, no smile, no drama, just the blank look of a man whose brain had designated the following 3 steps and nothing beyond them. "You're conscious," he said, voice even and controlled. The words came out flat and disciplined. "You're stuck," she answered, already scanning the scene for leverage. Above, something in the canopy emitted a crackling, almost electric call, and the air vibrated in sync with it. Lyra dropped into the crevice, landing with a roll that jarred her wounded arm but left her upright. Kaen's teeth were pink at the edges when he spoke. "Can you free it?" "Likely." She dug in her own kit, found an injector rod, and braced it against one of the slabs inches from his leg. Tapping the sensor on the rod, the injector expanded on both ends, burning into the ground while hoisting the metal slab away from Kaen, enough for him to wiggle free. For a moment, his weight nearly folded her as she helped by pulling his arms toward her. But she took the weight, wincing at the pain in her arm as her legs did their best to steady them. Kaen quickly got his balance and held her close for a moment. Only then did she let herself look at his face. The lines of shock and effort were carved deep across his cheekbones. They moved, not quickly, but with the mechanical clarity of 2 people whose bodies had learned to navigate pain as a map. Kaen took point, adjusting his helmet, ignoring the pain of his wound, and climbed the side of the crevice, glancing behind to make sure Lyra followed in his tracks, then scanning the canopy for predators or worse. At the top of the crevice, he shifted to scan their surroundings, his visor already picking up unknown predator signatures in the distance. Positioning himself protectively in front of her, he stood with his stance low and his pulse even. Stay close, we move on my mark. The shuttle is trashed, but I'm glad you're okay. I'd hate to think of being stuck here alone, she said above a whisper. Her words burned through him, and all he could think was, I'd never let you come here without me. Never stop doing what it takes to get you back home safe. Never stop watching over you. Kaen swallowed hard, squeezing his eye to bury the unspoken words. We're definitely not alone, he said quietly. Predatory creatures were already moving in the distance, drawn by the heat and commotion of the crash. Kaen and Lyra assessed the shuttle's damage together. The comm array was crushed beyond repair, and the navigation system was dead. Only the emergency pack had survived, containing a thermal tarp, a ration case, medical supplies, an ignition stick, a single field tracker, and a force field generator. Their moment of assessment was cut short by a guttural howl splitting the air. Lyra turned to see shadows rippling across the smoke not far away. What was that? Not friendly, Kaen replied matter-of-factly, his hand moving to his weapon strapped to his thigh. Ridge to the west, he suggested with a chin lift. Move. Acid-tinged rain fell in sheets as Lyra and Kaen climbed toward higher ground. Green lightning spiderwebbed across the sky in unnatural arcs, briefly illuminating predators as they slipped between the alien trees. The terrain is treacherous, slick with rain, and littered with unfamiliar vegetation. Lyra stumbled once on the slippery ground. Kaen caught her by the wrist, his grip steady as steel. Keep moving. You stop, they'll circle, he warned. The creatures tracked them in movements that became more coordinated as they closed in. Lyra showed determination despite her sore arm and throbbing shoulder. Kaen was hyper-aware of both her condition and the threats surrounding them. They finally reached a shallow cave carved into basalt rock, a natural overhang that offered shelter from the storm. Kaen swept the area with his scanner once and nodded in approval. He jammed the tracker node into the trunk of a nearby tree, explaining to Lyra that the signal was transmitting, but the main ship might not pick it up until the storm cleared. Kaen sealed the entry with the emergency tarp, deploying the alloy anchors into the rock walls. On the inside, inches from the tarp, he set up the emergency force field. Inside, shadows pressed close around them. Lyra sank to her knees, her body finally giving in to exhaustion, and began to shake. Kaen crouched beside her, methodically checking his weapon's charge. The storm screamed outside their makeshift shelter, while inside, their breathing filled the quiet. Kane's gaze lingered on Lyra, noting the blood on her cheek, her matted hair, and her eyes still bright, despite obvious exhaustion. We wait it out, he says, his voice low but certain. The others will get the tracking signal. May take a while until this storm passes, if it passes. Lyra nodded, her voice trembling slightly as she asked, if it lasts all night? Kaen's response was immediate and unwavering. Then we survive all night. The tension between them shifted subtly in the confined space of the cave. The light inside the cave glowed a sickly blue, diffused from the tracker's beacon and rebounding against wet stone. Lyra kept close to the wall, the basalt's chill seeping through her flight suit, the rock scored with fossilized ripples from ancient water. How many billions of years had passed here before her boots, her blood, ever marked it? Humbling, if she let herself notice. Kaen took the far side of the entry, one knee down, weapon braced but low. His silhouette filled the gap between tarp and field generator, a presence that seemed larger than the cave. He hadn't removed his helmet, though she could see the crescent of blood tracing his scalp just above the right ear. Stubborn. Or maybe it just hurt less to hide behind the visor's dark. She wondered if the sound of her breathing reached him over the storm. Lyra inventory checked the emergency pack for the 20th time, fingers numb but precise. The ration bar already fingerprint dented, 2 bruised hypo-injectors, a water pouch nearly full. the field bandage kit she'd already used on Kaen's leg. Her own patch job was more makeshift. A tourniquet of wire and tape, sticky with blood, where the splintered canopy had sliced her forearm. She flexed the hand. Still functional, the night outside was alive with the calls of things she didn't have a name for. Occasionally, a heavy body would move against the tarp, testing the membrane with claws or blunt teeth. The force field spat each time, a tiny arc of blue spidering over the surface. Kaen didn't flinch at the noise, just turned his head fractionally, marking it, then resumed scanning the tree line through the scanner's heads-up. Lyra tried to rest, but her muscles never allowed the luxury. She let her head drop back against the stone, watching the beads of condensation gather and swell on the cave ceiling. Each one seemed to hold a version of her reflection, distorted, frantic, some in negative colors. None of them reflected her at ease. Her face was the last thing she wanted to see. Fear was deep set in her eyes. She glanced at Kaen, feeling the weight of 6 years' worth of professional restraint lodged somewhere in her throat. Before the drop, she'd imagined they were a team. After the crash, she realized there was a gulf between knowing someone as a comrade and needing them as the only protection against extinction. It was a dangerous kind of dependency, one she'd been trained to recognize and resist. But the world outside the shelter didn't care about training. She coughed once, trying to ease the silence. Any word on the pulse? Kaen shook his head. The helmet amplified the motion. Signals outbound but unconfirmed. Nothing back from orbit. They may be down too. His voice, filtering through the comm, didn't betray doubt. That would have been a luxury. Lyra swallowed. How long do you give us before we're not alone down here? Her hand drifted to the drive at her chest. The gesture was involuntary, a child's reflex to protect the most precious thing in reach. Kaen considered thumb-sliding across his weapon, not responding. 2. Choices. The storm outside chewed at the cave's mouth, gnashing wind and acid rain against the stretched polymer tarp. Each surge spat green-lit filaments across the basalt interior, painting Lyra and Kaen in flickering auroras, then plunging them back into ghoulish dimness. The cave itself was little more than a wound on the hillside, 10 feet deep. Its ceiling was low enough that Kane's scalp nearly brushed the mineral crust if he sat up straight. They wedged themselves side by side at the back wall, boots braced on slick stone, while the world outside appeared as if it tried to unmake itself. Lyra hunched into herself, arms against her thighs. Her suit was supposed to be acid-resistant, but a dozen micro-tears caused by the crash glittered wetly along the sleeves, each one stinging with the day's exposure. Beneath the synthetic fiber, she wore only a sweat-soaked tech shirt and the kind of fatigue pants you could live or die in for weeks at a stretch. Her hair, coiled and usually well-maintained, now sprang wild against her pale cheekbones, the humidity curling it into a frizzed halo. She'd been shivering so long it had become a secondary pulse, a counter-rhythm to the thrum of her heart. Kaen checked his weapon for the 3rd time in as many minutes. He'd stripped the pulse rifle down and rebuilt it by touch alone, not because he doubted its function, but because the repetitive action was its own anchor. The cold in the cave was bone-deep and sharp, but it helped his normally hot body stay comfortably cool. Fingers moved with deliberate, measured motions. Once satisfied, he set the rifle upright between his knees, his eyes fixed on the cave opening. The first howl came like an aftershock, distant but unmistakable. Something patient with an immune system, tolerant to acid rain. Lyra's jaw clenched. She was not the type to flinch, but the line of her mouth thinned with every howl. The storm amplified the sound, rolling across the stone. They're not close, Kaen said, voice low and calm. He didn't look at her. He never did, not when she was unraveling, not wanting her to feel ashamed. We're upwind. They shouldn't be able to track us easily. Lyra exhaled slowly, controlling the tremor of her body, not worried about the pack, more concerned the tarp will fail. She glanced at the mouth of the cave, where the polymer rippled in the wind, held in place by 4 drilled anchors. Her hands twitched with the ghost's memory of helping him set those anchors. The storm would painfully rip flesh from bone if it breached the cave. She'd seen the results of something similar happen to another team, another planet. "We'll patch as needed," Kaen said, matter-of-factly. He finally turned, his storm-gray eyes unblinking in the gloom. There was a smear of blood across his left brow. Not fresh, but not fully dried either. His skin, dark as scorched iron in some areas, was cross-hatched with new nicks from shrapnel and old, silvery scars. Kaen wore them as part of his uniform. Silence fell, not comfortable, but earned. Lyra studied her boots and tried not to think about the hunger gnawing at her gut. They'd rationed one of the few meal bars after putting up the tarp and force field, splitting it into a wordless communion. Even then, Kaen had insisted she take the larger piece, using a grunted, "You'll last longer," as his only logic. She let herself lean back against the cave wall, pressing shoulder to shoulder with him. His body still radiated heat, more than she'd expected. But she was happy for the Skalarian high baseline temperature, due to their denser muscle mass. Her own limbs felt leaden. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the sprint to this cave had bottomed out, leaving a fluttery vacuum in its place. The second howl was definitely closer. Lyra's hand moved instinctively to the little sidearm strapped to her thigh, though she knew her aim may be laughable against anything out there, since she barely used it as a science tech. She pressed her palm to the weapon anyway, a small comfort, and counted her breaths until the sound tapered off. Kaen shifted beside her, subtly, but it felt like an entire world moving. She didn't look, but she felt the new tension in his thigh against hers, the micro-readjustment of his center of gravity to place himself closer to the cave entrance. "You're shaking," he finally voiced. She almost laughed. "No shit. Didn't think I still had the energy to do it." Kaen made a low sound, almost a chuckle, but not quite. "You should get some rest." "Like you're going to," Lyra shot back, more tired than tart. "We both know you're going to sit there awake until the storm passes, counting heartbeats." "Counting threats," he corrected, but she heard the admission in his tone. He didn't deny the rest. Rain hammered the tarp in sudden violence, sending a curtain of green-lit spray through one of the seams. Lyra flinched at the hiss, more from reflex than any rational fear. The cave instantly smelled of ozone and something acrid, like soldering wire fusing with the damp mineral tang, as the force field was nearly breached. She drew her knees up to her chest. It made her smaller and more insulated, yet left no room for pretense. She was tucked into Kane's flank, close enough to feel the way his chest rose and fell, slow and unshakable. His scent was unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. Dust, sweat, copper, and the lingering, almost sweet burn of blood. She meant to say something else, maybe about the mission, or the odds of surviving longer than a day on this planet, but the words dissolved on her tongue. Instead, she fixed her gaze on a seam of quartz running through the ceiling, each shard catching stormlight like a vein of fireflies, and tried to let the pattern hypnotize her. The next time the predators howled, she didn't react. Kaen's hand was already on the cave floor, fingers splayed in the loose grit, his claws pressing into the stone, ready to spring if anything breached their perimeter. He didn't bother with words. He just inched closer, letting his body shield hers from the mouth of the cave. They sat like that for a long time, in a daze of adrenaline and aftershocks. The only movement was the slow, baseline shiver running through Lyra's shoulders. Sweat beaded at her hairline, cold and electric, and every so often Kane's thigh flexed beside hers, as if testing the boundaries of patience or proximity. She almost forgot about the bleeding scratch on her hand, until a drop of it traced a line down her wrist, mixing with the condensation, slicking the stone. Lyra watched it for a moment, mesmerized by the way it spiderwebbed out in the fissures, then wiped it away on the inside of her sleeve. Kaen noticed. She could tell by the way his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Eventually, the wind slackened and the howls receded, replaced by the mechanical rhythm of rain slapping tarp. Lyra exhaled, feeling the exhaustion wrapping her in something almost gentle. She let her head tip forward until it rested against her own bent knees. "You can sleep. I'll wake you if anything changes," Kaen said, almost a whisper. She didn't answer, but her next breath was slower, less ragged. For a few heartbeats, she let herself curl tighter as Kaen let himself be her shield. The storm raged on outside, whipping anything not fastened, drifting further away, but the space inside the cave, dank and mineral-rich and cut through with blood and ozone, held. The growl wasn't distant. It ripped through the darkness like a fusion detonator, shuddering the entire cave, raining loose dust and mineral grit onto Lyra's bowed head. She jerked upright, eyes wild and instantly awake. The sound wasn't just loud, it was deep, seismic, a warning call that vibrated the stones as much as the air. Lyra's first instinct was always to analyze, label, hypothesize, and extrapolate. But the predator's proximity drove all training into her marrow, and this time she moved not out of reason, but from the primitive twitch that said hide. She pressed herself into Kaen's side, her face pressed into the wet, salt-streaked fabric of his suit, arms clutching at his torso like a lifeline. Kaen's body locked rigid beneath her touch. For a fraction of a second, Lyra wondered if she'd made a mistake, if this was one of those boundaries you didn't cross with a Skalarian, especially in survival mode. Then, in the space between two heartbeats, his tension liquefied, and one arm drew her in, a seamless sweep that pinned her to his chest. His other hand never left the cave floor, fingers spread in anticipation, ready to launch violence at whatever breached the threshold. The smell of rain and ozone thickened, riding a wind that now tasted faintly of something musky, animal, hot, metallic. She could feel Kaen's breath above her scalp, each exhale a measured beat, steady enough to outpace the surge in her own. Lyra tried to match his rhythm, tried to use the science of mimicry to trick her body into calm, but her pulse skittered out of sync every time another echoing roar ricocheted through the cave. She didn't mean to move her hand. It was supposed to anchor her, palm flat, to the center of Kaen's chest, feeling the dull thud of his heart. But the stormlight and fear had rewired her sense of self, and she realized she was tracing the seam of his chest plate, fingertips catching on the armor's ridges and then slipping down to the sweat-slicked band of uniform beneath. The tactile feedback was hypnotic, the shift from hard alloy to the softer give of the underlayer, the way his muscle tensed and released beneath her exploratory pressure. Kaen didn't move otherwise, not at first, but she could feel the minute calibrations in his posture, the way his head turned slightly toward her, the rise in temperature where his jaw hovered just above her hair. His restraint was absolute, but it vibrated with an energy she could almost imagine under his skin, waiting for permission to break free. The creature howled again, this time right outside the tarp, a faint outlined silhouette near the base. Lyra involuntarily curled tighter against Kaen, her entire body tensed in preparation for violence. He shifted to accommodate, his arm like a band of steel around her shoulders, bringing her as close as anatomy allowed. The fabric of his suit was saturated, both from rain and the low-grade bleeding from his head, and Lyra inhaled it, desperate for some signal that wasn't panic. There was a story in every scar she saw, every rough edge. She mapped them with the clinical precision of someone who'd cataloged 100 tissue samples, but now it was all living, pulsing reality. "Stay still," Kaen whispered, barely audible over the storm. "I can't," Lyra hissed back. Her lips brushed the fabric. Not quite a voice, more vibration. "It's too close. They're not hunting us. They're afraid of the lightning. We may have taken refuge in one of their dens," he murmured. but she could feel his own adrenaline spiking, the way his heart rate had doubled to match hers. The tarp flapped violently as the anchors groaned. Lyra felt the motion translate through the ground, up through Kane's ribcage, into her own. Her hand had migrated up to the side of his neck, thumb pressed just beneath the angle of his jaw. The skin was surprisingly smooth under her thumb. She could feel his steady, relentless pulse. He was a Skalarian, post-conflict generation, rumored to have redundancy built into their DNA. It felt like the safest thing she'd ever touched, or the most dangerous. She realized, finally, that she was trembling harder now, not just from fear. Every sensory input was amplified. The electric green and violet of the storm outside, the wet animal funk that the winds pushed just beyond the tarp, Kane's heat bleeding through layers of gear, the constant, grounding drum of his heartbeat. There was no space left in her mind for analysis, only this wild, raw contact. Lightning fired again. So close, the light felt solid. For a split second, the cave was daylit, every feature thrown into high resolution against the jagged black basalt, the runnels of water on the walls, the imprint of Lyra's own hand against Kane's neck. In that instant, she saw the flash of his teeth, his fangs, just barely bared, not in a threat, but in a grimace that looked almost like a smile. "Don't let go," she whispered. It slipped out, accidental and vulnerable. He didn't. His grip tightened, the pressure calibrated to the point just before pain. His other hand, the one on the cave floor, flexed and then relaxed, the need for violence temporarily superseded by the imperative to anchor her. The animal outside let out a final, frustrated snarl, then retreated as the force field barrier flickered and sparked when a gust of wind hurled leaves and twigs its way. The absence was a vacuum, an almost physical recoil. Lyra sagged into Kaen, her forehead resting against the slope of his collarbone. For a long moment, neither moved. "Thought you Skalarians didn't touch other species," she managed, half joking, breath still catching on the syllables. Kaen's voice was even lower, almost lost to the rain. "Most don't. Some of us, if we have to." Her laugh was hoarse, but it vibrated through both of them. "So, this is what? Medical necessity?" He angled his head until his lips brushed her hairline. "If that's what you want to call it." They stayed like that, suspended in a hush punctuated only by the diminishing storm. Lyra's hand traced small, unconscious circles along the hollow at the base of Kaen's throat, memorizing the intersection of heat and vulnerability. She wondered if she would ever be able to forget this sensation, or if she even wanted to. The cave was quieter now. The storm in the world beyond seemed impossibly distant, like a dream that had lost its power to terrify. All that remained was the two of them, locked in a circuit of breath and touch, each feeding off the other's presence. When Lyra finally dared to look up, her face was inches from Kaen's. His eyes, usually hard as alloy, had softened around the edges. The storm gray flecked with a light just for her. She was sure he'd say something final, something that would put them back into their separate, armored selves. Instead, Kaen just watched her. And in the absence of words, Lyra found that this strange, violent world was bearable, at least for tonight. The silence that followed the animal's retreat was almost obscene. Lyra could hear her own pulse, still rattling wild in her veins, and the answering echo in Kaen's chest, where her cheek pressed bone flat to his sternum. The storm's tantrum had abated, and in its aftermath, every sound was magnified. The trickle of condensation down the walls, the wheeze of their mingled breath, the sticky rustle of damp clothes clinging to skin. Lyra didn't know if she was shaking from cold, adrenaline, or the aftershocks of the panic she'd let herself ride. She waited for Kaen to let go, to reassert that careful distance they'd maintained since orbit fall. Instead, he surprised her. His hand moved up, not to push her away, but to cup her jaw, thumb rough against the angle of her cheek, careful not to press his claws into her flesh. He wiped at a crust of dried blood along her hairline, and the gentleness of it was almost jarring. Lyra tilted into his touch, the sensation grounding her far more than any rational self-talk. "Hold still," he said, voice a low, battered rumble. She almost retorted, not much else to do, but the words withered as his fingers slid up to the temple, careful not to break her skin with his claws, checking for fractures, then back down to her mouth. Lyra parted her lips to breathe, and his thumb hovered there for a beat before tracing the shape of her lower lip. It wasn't a verification anymore. It was permission. 3. Morning. Gray light seeped through the tarp seams before the internal clock in Lyra's head reached 0. She surfaced from a deep sleep, limbs slow to recalibrate, every joint thick with the memory of the storm. Then something sweeter. The first exterior sensation was the chill. The second was Kaen's breath, steady and close, stirring the fine hair at her temple. She blinked at the arch of their emergency shelter. Dew lacquered the walls, catching the light. Kaen rested with his back braced against the stone wall, one boot drawn up defensively. Lyra knew by the controlled breathing and the twitch of fingers against his thigh that he was already awake. She waited for the moment he'd open his eyes, but he beat her to it. Gray irises flickered behind lids, then focused on her in a single, unguarded beat before the mask of composure resettled and the red rings faded. He didn't speak, not right away, but his gaze still tracked over her with the clinical precision of a field medic. She returned it, gaze for gaze, until something like a smile threatened at the edge of his mouth and the red rings of his eyes flickered. Acknowledgement. Your shoulder? Kane's voice was sandpaper, edged by hours of disuse. Lyra rolled onto her side, sat up, and began massaging her shoulder. There was still some tenderness, but not as restrictive as before. Less tender, she said, and fished the emergency kit from the rucksack with one hand. How's your head? Kaen didn't respond, instead made no objection, only scooted nearer as Lyra motioned to inspect the bandage she'd applied the night before. The space between them was no longer a polite, demilitarized zone. It now felt like a hinge, something newly flexible, but fragile. Lyra unfolded the kit with one practice sweep, laying out the pads and vials in a row like chess pieces. She picked the last sterile patch, the square of gauze luminous against her palm, and loaded the tip with a measure of antiseptic. Looks better. This will keep it clean while it heals, Lyra said, gently redressing the wound. Glad to see it hasn't impaired your motor skills or vision. Be sure you get it checked when we get back to the ship. The cut itself was unimpressive, a shallow slice cresting the temporal ridge. Lyra worked in silence, cleaning the blood, applying the sealant, then smoothing the patch with her index finger until the microfilaments activated and the bandage fused to skin. Kaen neither flinched nor tensed. He simply watched her, lips tight, eyes storm dark. He inclined his head, as though conceding a point in a silent debate. Lyra swept the rest of his scalp clean, her thumb bracing the side of his head. She could feel the faint heat where his pulse beat. Skalarian thermoregulation was infamous, but even their kind had limits. She let her hand rest there for an extra moment, not for the wound, but to remember the touch of him. Done. Her voice was lower than she intended, nearly gentle. He nodded, then caught her wrist. Not tightly, not for long, just long enough for his thumb to map the line of her pulse, as if measuring its reliability. Lyra didn't pull away. For a breath, they existed in that cross-current of sensation. Her heartbeat, his grip, the memory of last night hanging unspoken between them. Then the moment collapsed, and they both returned to their tasks. Lyra repacked the kit, taking care with each component, and Kaen set about unrigging the force field and tarp. Their movements were efficient and military, yet careful in a way that suggested a new, mutual caution. There was no risk of eye contact, not after what had passed between them, yet every step was mapped to avoid collision, every handoff of equipment deliberate. The world outside was muted, all color filtered by the damp. Water splashed, dripped from the overhang in a rhythm that matched Lyra's pulse as she rolled a tarp. She risked a glance at Kaen, who was already inventorying the last rations. We have a full hour before the search grid resets, based on my calculations, she said, retying her curls at the nape. Her voice was crisp, controlled. Kaen made a non-committal sound, but there was approval in the way he cocked his head. You think the uplink's live? Lyra asked. Only if the relay survived. But it's not our first priority. He held out the canteen, a tacit reminder of protocol. Lyra drank the water cold and bracing. Her tongue tasted ozone and a residue of blood, hers, not his. They dressed in their suits in silence, checked the seals, then stepped out from under the overhang. The air was laden with the sense of wet soil from the storm, the ground spongy underfoot, the flora reset into 100 new permutations by the violence of the night. Lyra inhaled, and the world smelled faintly of ions and crushed fern-looking brush. As they double-checked each other's suits, Lyra caught the edge of a question in Kaen's profile, whether the mission or their night together mattered more. The thought rippled across his face and then vanished, as if he'd thrown it into a ravine. We'll keep heading north, she said, calibrating the tracker. There's a plateau 3 clicks up, if we can get a line of sight. We wait, Kaen finished, voice clipped. He shouldered his pack, then held out his hand in an after-you gesture. Lyra accepted it, fingers brushing his palm, then led the way into the dripping morning. He grabbed the tracker from where he'd embedded it the night before. It made them a now-moving target for their ship to find and send a rescue. The path out of the cave was steep but manageable, every foothold slick, every outcrop a potential hazard. Kaen shadowed her at a precise distance, his presence a buffer against whatever predators survived the storm. Now and then, she caught the echo of last night in his posture, the way he ducked under a branch to shield her, the way his hand hovered at her back but never touched. At the mouth of the ravine, Lyra stopped and turned. The shelter was already invisible, lost to the folds of mist, trees, and stone. She looked at Kaen, caught his gaze, and held it. There was something unspoken that needed articulation, but neither of them possessed the vocabulary. So, she just nodded, and he nodded back, and the wordless agreement bound them tighter than any oath. They moved out, step by step, into an unfamiliar world that had been rearranged. The tension between them wasn't broken. It was repurposed, like current rerouted through a new circuit. And as they climbed toward open sky, Lyra felt the warmth of his last touch ghost across her back, a reminder of what they'd left in the shelter and what awaited beyond it. They followed the ridge, feet moving over root and rock, Lyra counting each tracker ping. At the second outcrop, she stopped and raised the device. Its pinpoint light pulsed with the cycle of a distant mothership, a reminder that help existed, just out of sight. He gestured for her to drop, and together they crouched beneath the bole of a storm-damaged tree. As he watched movement on his barely functioning helmet visor. In the charged hush, the tracker's ping escalated urgent, almost frantic, until Lyra silenced it. Kaen set his jaw, then signaled. Now. Lyra broke cover and sprinted upslope, beacon in hand, punching the activation code into the panel. The device spat out a focused radio pulse, triangulating their position to the rescue team. She risked a glance back. Kaen was already climbing, using the muscle in his arms to clear the last feet with brutal efficiency. Below in the distance, a pack of 4-legged creatures zigzagged the terrain on approach. At the summit, Lyra collapsed against a slab of stone, chest hollow with effort. Kaen joined her, wiping sweat from his chin. The sky, just visible through the churn of newly formed clouds, flickered with the distant blue of ion engines. They didn't speak, as relief of rescue and disappointment of not being alone a little longer covered their faces. The air shuddered with a bass note as the rescue cutter breached the cloud deck. Its turbines hammered the mist, flattening every tree and bush below with the force of its downdraft. The commotion made the creatures in pursuit scatter in different directions. Lyra shielded her face as debris whipped past. Kaen turned his back to it. One hand braced on her shoulder to keep her steady. The cutter hovered, doors sliding open to reveal the silhouettes of medtechs in hazard suits, arms raised in greeting or command, it was hard to tell. Two metallic harnesses uncoiled from the belly, smacking the ground with the wet slap of a reptile tail. Lyra hesitated, but only for a second. She stepped into the harness and held on as her legs dangled once being hoisted up. Kaen followed next to her, his ascent as controlled as everything else about him. At the midpoint, Lyra looked at him. What passed between them was not gratitude for helping to survive the crash, but a silent recognition of companionship, of silent promises made that would be honored. The ascent ended inside the pressurized bay of the cutter. Medical hands pulled Lyra in, strapping her to a gurney, sensors snapping onto her temples and wrists. She tried to protest, but the world tilted sideways, her vision narrowing to a tunnel of light and then nothing. A commanding Skalarian officer arrived with their own tablet, voice crisp and empty of affect. He was only a year older than Kaen and began reciting the checklist. Name, rank, function. Nature of incident. Duration of exposure. Kaen answered in the dialect of the demobilized. Last name first. No embellishment. No story beyond the data. Vainik, Kaen. Mission, combat engineer. Accompanying a civilian scientist for a terrain survey. Crash site at 38.22 north, 102.7 east, 16.5 hours before extraction. Hostile weather caused the ship's malfunction. Storms full of particulate charge with acidic rain. Definite signs of hostile animal life. The officer did not look up. Number of casualties? None. 2 aboard, both accounted for. Injuries? Non-fatal. Treated on site. Recommend re-exam on ship. Additional environmental hazards. Kaen hesitated, a fractional pause. High radiation count in Sector 7. Unknown spores. Pack hunting animal life. Recommend quarantine for all inbound. Drone sample intake only. The officer typed, never glancing up. Any classified material lost? No, Kaen said, his eyes remaining as cool steel. All secured. The questioning shifted to Lyra. She gave her name, her function, and the precise coordinates of every anomaly they'd documented before the crash. She added nothing of the cave, the night, the blood on her hands and on his. When the officer asked, "Any additional details for your report?" she shook her head, hair sticking to the nape of her neck. The officers left satisfied. The med techs gave them both an injection before retreating behind the officer, prepping their cabin for atmospheric exit. Lyra woke some indefinite time later to the rhythmic beep of monitors and the familiar pressure of Kane's palm on her forearm. He was already sitting up, arguing in low tones with a technician who looked barely old enough to hold a scalpel. "I'm fine," Lyra croaked, and Kaen turned, relief flickering in his face before he buried the expression under protocol. "Vitals are good," agreed the tech, then left them alone as he made his way to the far wall console. Kaen leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "We're almost clear of the gravity. Orbit in 5. Lyra nodded. The smell of the cave was gone, replaced by antiseptic and synthetic air, but the memory of it hovered behind her eyelids. She met Kaen's eyes and, for the first time since the storm, let herself exhale fully. "Next time," she said, We don't fly down through any storms. Kayan's mouth twitched. Agreed. The cutter banked, thrusters firing in concert, and Lyra felt the sudden weight of acceleration pin her to the bed. She watched the world outside blur into streaks of blue and white, and in the reflected glass of the viewport, Kayan's eyes met hers dark, certain, and full of every want and desire they hadn't said so far that day. For a moment, the noise and bustle receded. Kayan looked at her, expression softer. It'll all reset once we reach the ship. We'll fall into the rhythm of our duties. They were out of the storm, but neither of them truly believed, even for a second, that the current between them would ever settle or reset. Lyra wanted to say she agreed to make things easier, but the words dissolved before reaching her mouth. So she reached for his wrist and let her fingers rest there, pulse against fingertips. He let her. His hand turned, wrapping hers for the second time since the cave, neither of them caring if the medtechs or the officers saw. They sat like that as the cutter bucked and rattled, climbing through the last layers of cloud. When they finally broke into the hush of the upper atmosphere, Lyra looked down at the receding world, her pale reflection overlaying the shattered sky of the orb. Kayan's profile hovered in the viewport beside her own, the two of them stitched together by the double image. A silent acknowledgement, decision, promise. The world below faded to swirls of blue, mixed with violet, then to black. Above them, the future waited on the mother ship, unknowable, indifferent, and alive with electricity. He squeezed her hand once and held on as the cutter pressed them both toward whatever came next for them. Thanks for listening and sharing your thoughts. If you'd like the full, unfiltered story, written as an open-door romance, you can find it and my other books on Amazon. Links are in the description.